Good evening, everyone, to all of you who have joined us from Eastern Europe, and good morning, or good afternoon rather, to those who have joined us from the East Coast and the United States of America. And welcome to the sixth iteration of our now extremely popular and famous American University of Kiev Talks, or AUK Talks. As you all know, those of you who have joined us previously, the AUK Talks are a series of online seminars aimed or designed rather to bring together the brightest minds in the field of international relations, foreign policy, international security, and of course, those who have studied Russia and Eastern Europe, which is especially useful to our Ukrainian audience in the context of the ongoing war by Russia against Ukraine. My name is Mark Voyager. I'm the director of the master's program at AUK. And once again, welcome to all of you, and allow me, of course, to welcome our speakers, our guests for tonight. We are extremely privileged to have today two of the top Western experts from the US and UK, experts on Russia and on Eastern Europe, who both combined have many decades of experience in that field. Both of them have lived or worked extensively in either the former Soviet Union, also the former Eastern Bloc, and of course nowadays they've continued to provide cutting-edge analysis to a range of Western media, think tanks, etc. So without further ado, Mr. Brian Whitmore with the Atlantic Council, and Mr. James Scher with the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, Estonia. So welcome, Brian, James. Thank you very much for making the time. Thank you very much for your prompt response and for agreeing to speak to our Ukrainian audience. Your insights are always unique, and in this respect, they will be extremely useful to our Ukrainian community of interest. So let me start with the fact that we all saw what happened today. We also saw the parade, Putin. We heard Putin's speech, Putin's words. So I'd like to open the discussion with just really simple, but at the same time, the billion-dollar question. What do you think, in the context of what we saw and heard, what does victory constitute for Putin? In your opinion, what is he aiming for? What we saw today, and then we'll go into more details and have a more lively discussion. After we've kind of covered some of the topics. So, who would like to? Shall we go with an alphabetical order, or how do you prefer to? Okay, well, Brian, you're at the top of the screen, so why don't you start?
I mean, thank you, Mark, and hello to everybody out there. My reaction to Putin's speech today was that it turned out to be a big nothing burger. I mean, it was more notable for what wasn't said than for what was said. There was no formal declaration of war, as some people had speculated might happen. There was no mass mobilization. There was no declaration of victory, which is obvious. There is no victory visible at the moment. There were not even threats to nuke the West. It was just a bunch of tired old lies that we've all heard before. The absurd talking points about Nazis in Ukraine and defending the motherland. So this speech made it clear to me that Putin appears to be out of options in Ukraine. His initial blitzkrieg failed, and now he's failing in eastern Ukraine. Russian forces are being pushed back from Kharkiv. So, I mean, the other thing that struck me about today, Mark, was that Zelensky stole the show again. Here's the line from Zelensky's speech that stood out for me. He said, "We will never forget what our ancestors did in World War II, where more than 8 million Ukrainians died. Every fifth Ukrainian didn't return home. Soon there will be 2 victory days in Ukraine, and someone will not even have one left. We won then, we will win now too." Zelensky kind of stole the show today. His speech was much more notable than Putin's, and this is a metaphor for the entire war thus far. This is a metaphor for what we've seen since February 24th. On February 24th, I said we are either about to witness the beginning of the end of Ukraine, or we're about to witness the beginning of the end of Putin. And today I am more convinced than ever that it is the latter. So, I mean, what constitutes victory for Russia has been ever shifting. It began with regime change and decapitation. Now it's changing to controlling the Donbass. I think we should be asking a different question. What constitutes victory for Ukraine? Because I think that is the more likely scenario than victory for Russia.
Okay. Well, definitely many questions to unpack as we go through our discussion. But James, why don't you, take the floor and share your insights on that, and then we'll go from there.
Brian brilliantly and mercifully spoke for only 2 minutes, so I am going to speak for, I am going to be predatory and speak for 7 or 8. Get us started. Yes, no, obviously, 9th of May has not literally been a turning point for reasons Brian said. First point on general mobilization. We need to understand there is a military, a systemic military reason why it hasn't taken place. Russia is no longer capable of administering this. Part of the reason for that is very paradoxical. For a couple decades, a lot of experts, some forward-looking people in Russia itself, were lamenting the fact that the Russian army had an extremely Sovietized view of its security as preparing for a great general war. It was preserving this huge Soviet-style mobilization system. Then there was the war in Georgia, which looked like a great victory, but it exposed all manner of deficiencies. And the result of this is that you had a defense minister appointed, whose name was Serdyukov, who turned the whole military system in Russia upside down and focused it on winning the kind of wars that Georgia posed a challenge, the kind of challenge that Georgia posed to Russia. And one consequence of that is that this Soviet-era mobilization system was largely dismantled. Now, paradoxically, Russians have started what they thought would be a small war against those who, for endemic reasons, they regard as little Russians rather than authentic nation and capable nation in its own right. And they have found themselves in the largest war the biggest and most complex and most damaging war they have fought since the Second World War. And that system is no longer there. But that reality is symptomatic of something much deeper. If you look at the dysfunctionalities that we have seen in the performance of the Russian army, the pathologies we have seen inside it, you realize it doesn't take much effort to realize they are symptomatic of what has been happening in Russian society itself. I think that Russia's political order today is rapidly mutating and in a state of decomposition. This, in the short term, is nothing to celebrate. It is full of dangers. And that, to a large extent, as much as these endemic views about Ukrainians explain why things have turned out the way they have. Now, I will appear to contradict myself by saying, to this point, Putin, the Kremlin, the establishment, even the general staff of the armed forces do not believe they have lost. They do not believe they cannot win. They are determined to do everything possible to win, and they are still doubling down. A question all of us have to face is the following. What will Putin do when he finally knows he is beaten? And what will he be allowed to do by others? And that question keeps me up at night, and it needs to keep us up at night. Finally, my literal answer to Mark's question, what constitutes victory? I will repeat what I said at the very start of the operations in Crimea and Donbass in 2014. That Putin's objective in Ukraine is either to subordinate it or wreck it. That is what we see him doing. He is trying to create conditions that make a sustainable, independent Ukrainian state a material possibility, even if it remains a psychological possibility. That's the reality you are living with in Ukraine. I'm devastated I cannot be there in person. At least I'm here morally, virtually, and in spirit. And one more point just before I stop, because we in the West, who are always behind the curve, are still preoccupied with a serious issue which has to do with Russian disinformation and Russia's information offensive here. And many people, as a result of this preoccupation, have missed the bigger issue, which is the info war inside Russia itself. The Russian people today live in a psychotropic information environment. We are dealing with a form of collective madness over there, which makes prospects of any kind of future pragmatic relationship with Russia, of any fundamental agreement about what reality is and where we find ourselves in this reality, all but impossible. So on that cheerful note, I'll stop.
Yeah, James, thank you very much, and definitely what you and Brian have covered, is leading me to many in many directions, of course, and I'm sure in about 20 minutes our audience will also have many questions to ask you. But let me follow up on something you said that about the Russian leadership, and of course, Brian, you're welcome also to comment on that. When I see more and more comments, and also as someone who remembers the Soviet days, there was even a photo kind of blending Brezhnev's image with that of Putin. It seems to me the Russian leadership is becoming gerontocratic. I mean, even in a psychological, if you will, biological way, they're so stuck in their old ways, trying to recreate, as a matter of fact, some mythical Soviet reality, and that they're beginning to act like Brezhnev, the late Brezhnev era. Is that? Do you feel that, or do you think Putin still has the vigor of the early 2000s when he was this young and upcoming energetic president, or is he going the way of any other Soviet or Russian leader, for that matter, over the last century?
Neither of those. He is a truly dangerous individual at this point. Ukraine is a deeply personal issue for him. It always has been. Everything that has been happening there has defied all of his expectations, his understanding of reality. And what has happened is that the mask has now dropped. Literally, you all know the Putin face, the implacable face of being impervious to what is going on around him, constantly being constantly cool. The face created by all these years of training in the KGB. Now, increasingly, we see the face of a very angry man clenching his teeth. We also saw the remarkable photograph of an overweight, unfit Putin slumped in a chair, talking to Shoigu and holding the table. His hand reminded me of Hitler's right hand, which he hid, but it was still photographed in April 1945 when he was handing out medals to youngsters in the Hitler Jugend, shaking. Now, this is a man who is personally deteriorating. But the interesting systemic question, and Brian will have thoughts about this, is somebody who was able to take that photograph and publish it. And that provides, again, an indication that things are very unstable there. Things are going on. There's not just one plot we have to worry about. There are possibly others. Again, very confused situation. One other little detail. There is good evidence, indication. The two stalwarts of the system are very different ones. One, Vladislav Surkov, and the other one, Dmitry Kozak, who is an accomplished negotiator, very, very competent, are under house arrest. These are people who yesterday were considered not just loyalists, but very important components of this whole enterprise. And they appear to be under house arrest. They're certainly not been seen. And there are rumors about all sorts of other people. Of course, not all of these rumors are true, but not all of them are false either.
Interesting. So, Brian, what is your take on that?
No, I want to kind of riff off some of the things James said. As always, he kind of cuts to the heart of the matter and gives us a lot of stuff to chew on. I was very taken by the question James raised as the central question here. What will Putin do when he knows he is beaten? And the second question, what will he be allowed to do? Because I think this is the thing we need to prepare for. I think we are moving in the direction of a very likely Ukrainian victory here. And this issue being as emotional as it is for Putin, the mask being off, all of his assumptions about how the world is supposed to work have been shattered. And in that situation, he can be extraordinarily dangerous. So this is a very, very delicate moment. And a lot hinges, and this is on something else James raised here, a lot hinges on what happens inside the elite, because this goes to what he will be allowed to do. We've all heard the rumors of Surkov being under house arrest and Dmitry Kozak being under house arrest, and that's no small thing. Look, Dima Kozak has been with Putin since the St. Petersburg days. They served in the St. Petersburg government together. I used to refer to Kozak as Putin's Mr. Fix-It. If he had a problem that was just intractable, he would throw Dima Kozak at it. The guy's a workaholic. And a chain smoking workaholic. And the fact that somebody like that could be under house arrest is nothing short of shocking and tells me that there are fissures in the elite, but we don't have a lot of visibility into it. I used to be able to have a lot of visibility into the elite to kind of see who the factions were, who the clans were, who was opposing whom. We don't have that kind of visibility right now inside Russia. And it's really hard to figure out whether or not there are cracks in the elite at this moment. These arrests, and not just Kozak and Surkov, but there's over 100 security service officers, according to Andrei Soldatov, have been either placed under house arrest or arrested. I have a hypothesis about why this is going on. The US and UK intelligence leaks, I think, were partially designed to get inside of Putin's head, and I think they've succeeded in this. He obviously thinks there's a mole in there somewhere, and he seems to be going on a mole hunt. So we seem to be accelerating these fissures in the elite. But the question I have is that if Putin does want to truly do something crazy, if he is sensing defeat, what is there to stop him in the Russian elite? We don't have the visibility into the internal mechanics of this at this time. There were rumors prior to the launch of the invasion that Putin was seeing basically two people, Yuri Kovalchuk, who's a businessman, longtime associate of Putin, who's really into this mysticism. And there's a lot of speculation that he was the one that was feeding a lot of these ideas into Putin's head. And of course, Nikolai Patrushev, who is the most hardline anti-Western member of the establishment, probably even more hardline than Putin himself. Who else? I don't trust either of these men to stop Putin. Who can stop him? Maybe James has some thoughts on this, but I think this is the issue we need to be preparing ourselves for, because it's becoming an increasingly likely scenario.
I would just add to this.
That's...
If I can, Mark, just
please, of course.
There is no elite at this point. There are no cohesive institutions.
Mm-hmm.
You look at all of those people who are now most identified as being with the ones who Putin trusts, the ones he listens to. They really, you mentioned Kovalchuk, they don't have any institutional moorings. For years and years, and the process has been intensifying, people who are incompetent have been replaced by people who only have two qualifications: thuggery and absolute obedience. And that in itself explains a lot of what is going on. And why does this happen? Because Putin is going through a process that Stalin went through, where he distrusts anyone who might be competent, because a competent person has the ability to be an enemy, even if he has no wish to be. So anyone with the potential to be an enemy must be regarded as an enemy. Well, the systemic consequences of all of this are absolutely gruesome, but we see them. And why in that meeting, in the Security Council, one understands why all these people were sitting far away from Putin. Why are they all made to sit so far away from one another? Well, if they're all sitting around a table, one can talk to another, and somebody can say, with the support of somebody else, the General Staff or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Defense or the Economics Ministry cannot agree with that analysis. He can't allow that. So even in this circle of the Security and Defense Council, he has to maintain an atmosphere of total intimidation.
I would,
James, yeah.
I mean, I wanted to pick up on that, if I may, because I mean, James made the point of all of these people who Putin is listening to have no institutional moorings. I would argue nothing in Russia has any institutional moorings. Institutions in Russia are meaningless. It's a political system that's run by networks and patron-client relationships, by what Elena Ledinieva calls the systema, right? And this in this situation, this is dangerous, because what prevents a delusional leader from doing crazy stuff? It's usually institutions. It's almost always institutions, and there are no functioning institutions whatsoever in Russia. And this actually points to the root cause of this war in general, right? In addition to Russia's imperial syndrome, the root cause of this war is the two different political directions that Ukraine and Russia have taken since 1991. Remember, Ukraine and Russia had identical political crises in 93, 94, a power struggle between parliament and the president. Ukraine solved that in a very institutional way. They had early elections for the parliament and the president. And we all know the incumbent president, Leonid Kravchuk, lost that election and stepped down, setting a precedent that endures to this day. In Russia, we know what happened. The parliament was blown up. And Russia developed in this direction of a country with no institutions. Now, in this war, this gives an advantage to Ukraine. What we are witnessing in Ukraine, and I think this is not talked about enough, is that Ukraine in this war is the opposite of a failed state. It is the opposite of a failed state. It is a highly, highly, highly functional state right now, and not just with matters related to the war. Pensions are being paid, garbage is being collected. People, the state is working right now. Nobody could ever call Ukraine a failed state, and this is part of the reason why Ukraine has been so successful in this war. And the lack of institutions on Russia's hand is why it has been so unsuccessful. But it is those lack of institutions in Russia that make a defeated Russia so unspeakably dangerous at this moment.
Well, Bran, let me this is extremely important. Definitely, the functionality of Ukraine state, with all the demeaning, slanderous names that the Russian public and leadership calls the Ukrainians. Definitely, they have proven to be, the Western, the nation state that actually is able to function under such a mortal threat. Well, let me just keep you back onto the domestic level, and not so much challenge you, but ask you. So we spoke about the Soviet times, and James, obviously you mentioned Stalin. I mean, even the almighty Stalin was ultimately taken down, obviously not by institutions, but by Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulganin, obviously the Zhukov factor, and then you had Khrushchev, who 10 years later or so was taken down, not killed, of course, but pushed away, and then Brezhnev took over. So at every generation, you see factions within the Soviet leadership that were able to actually challenge the supreme leader. Why do we think it's not going to happen now? Or how do we see these dynamics?
Mark,
why is it Putin?
Mark, Stalin had to die. Stalin died first. And then you had a succession process that was very ugly and could have been even worse than it was had they not eliminated the most virulent contender, namely Beria. But I just want to add another thing. There is a deeper historical reason for the contrast we observe between Ukraine and Russia. And it lies in the fact that historically Ukraine has not had a state. It's had a nation. It's had a history of being a semi-state or a weak state or a dysfunctional state. And what that did is transfer the initiative to people and groups of individuals, individuals and groups of individuals. And it was always a very pluralistic entity, influenced by different outside imperialisms. And the result of that in Ukraine is that you had the emergence of a bottom-up culture. You've never had this in Russia. In Russia, it's very difficult historically to distinguish between the Russian state, the Orthodox Church, which is a creature of the state, and the Russian people. And in Ukraine, these things are different. And that's why you see it in the army, I have to say, until recently, and one might even say until today, including today. The general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces, which appear to have been sidelined largely in the running of this war, have in some ways been very Soviet. And so real initiative has been taken by battalion commanders. You now have a CHOD, chief of the general staff, I don't know what his exact title is now, who is dealing directly with battalion commanders because they make things happen. They're connected with reality and has sidelined this bureaucracy. In Russia, this does not happen. In Russia, if you have no orders, you do nothing but get killed. In Russia, if you have orders, even if they're absurd, you carry them out. In Russia, everyone is afraid to exercise initiative. In any organization, everything is centralized and hierarchical. Ukraine does not work like that.
Brian, any comment on potential groupings within?
Well, I mean,
the elite that might challenge Putin before we move to another mission.
I cannot imagine how there are not fissures in the Russian elite now. You're hearing like grumblings from different factions that do kind of break through, that this has upended the entire model that was actually very, very successful for Russia up until this point. Russia was able to be integrated with the Western economy, but yet behave like North Korea. It was able to have their yachts and their villas in the south of France, while at the same time behaving like a revisionist power. A lot of work has gone into building networks of influence in the West that are now being rolled up. Russia's being denied any access to Western financial or capital markets or Western technology. And there are people in the elite that realize this, that they kind of had a good thing going, and they've just lost that in the space of a couple of months. And there is no way that is not creating discontent within the elite. Just our ability to see this right now is difficult. It's limited to these little data points that, like James raised, how was Putin able to be photographed in that awful state he was in during that meeting with Shoigu? There are, I saw online today some posters that are being circulated that showing World War II generals saying, you're making us ashamed. We gave you peace, and look what you've done. So you do see rumblings of this, but it's hard to imagine how it's going to play out. This is really going back to the old days of Kremlinology, when we're trying to piece together different data points because we just don't have the visibility at this point. I mean, I have hypotheses about it, but I have no data to support my hypotheses or to refute them. Just intuitively, it's very clear to me that there has to be fissures inside that elite. And we certainly better hope so, because again, going back to James's original point of that, what will Putin do when he knows he is beaten? And I believe we are coming to that day soon, which is a great thing for Ukraine, but it is a terrifying thing in terms of what he might do. And
definitely it is. So before we actually move to this, billion-dollar question, what Putin might do and what are the most dramatic things that happen. Let's kind of leave the elite aside. Obviously, we can safely assume that so far we cannot see any discernible groupings that can take down Putin, and we can surmise that maybe some of the elite has actually consolidated because they've lost access to their Western assets, and they're now learning to live within the confines of Russia. So, but still, that's at the elite level. What about the population? Can we assume, based on intercepts of the Ukrainian intelligence, of conversations between soldiers and their families, I mean, this vitriolic hatred for Ukrainians, can we say that the war hasn't produced this critical mass of discontent among the Russian population? On the contrary, that there's actually this that Putin is actually winning the disinformation warfare at home, portraying, as we saw today, this is a war against Nazism, and then many Russians actually seem to believe that. Correct or not? What is your take?
The German expert who knows Russia very well, Sabine Fischer, recently wrote an article. And I'd agree with everything in it, but she made the most important point, that Russia is no longer an authoritarian political order. It is once again a totalitarian political order. And one feature of a totalitarian political order is this mass psychosis, this ability to, this determination to regulate what people think. Well, I don't think people in these opinion polls who are questioned, who say we should destroy every Ukrainian living, etc., are lying. But they're in a psychotropic environment where there is a penalty for thinking, and certainly for thinking aloud, and where they want to believe these things because they're easy to believe. But when reality is forced upon you, their reactions can be totally different. And where we see this happening is in the Russian army fighting in Ukraine. That's where reality, in the most brutal way, breaks through all of this. And the results are that part of the Russian army is actually imploding. You see this, where tankisti drive over their commanders. And what they thought before they went there is irrelevant to how they actually behave when these things are happening. Now, another aspect to this is they become insanely brutal. And we know what sort of insane brutalities have taken place. What we don't know is we also know that there are many more than what we know. This is a known unknown. So I don't know, Brian, you accept that analysis?
No, I do, James. I think you hit it on the head here. I mean, people choose to believe what they are expected to believe in this situation of this mass psychosis that you're describing. People know what they're supposed to believe, and they choose to believe it until they don't. until they don't. But I don't think we're there yet. I think there is enough fear in that society at the moment that people are choosing to believe what they're believing. We've all heard the conversations that Ukrainians are having with relatives in Russia, where the relatives in Russia are telling them, no, what you're telling me is not true because I saw it on Channel 1. This is another sign of that. So I think that's where we are right now. I'm not waiting for the Russian people to rescue us from this situation. Just put it that way.
No, absolutely not. But let me just add, two little vignettes. I have a very old, very good Russian friend. He's much younger than I am. He's not old, but I mean, I've known him for a long time. Russian friend in London, who's also a British citizen. And his parents live in Russia. And he's told me, and it's taken him a long, long time to see things differently from he did when he arrived in 2006, which was a very sane time in Russia compared to what we're looking at. He said, when I go over there, and this was well before the present, for 2 days and listen to television, I start to get drawn into all of this. I start to think the way they do. It's very difficult to snap out of it. I keep trying to snap out of it, but it's very difficult. There's a sometime Ukrainian colleague I know in the Razumkov Center. After 2014, his job was to monitor Russian television. He told me that if he does this for 24 hours, he needs a day off. He has to recover. I mean, it's so totally enveloping this world. They're in an alternative reality. And obviously the people who create it are terrified about what will happen if another reality intrudes into it. And that's what the war is doing. So I think also the war is accelerating this, irrespective of what happens on the battlefield, the war is accelerating this mutation and decomposition of the political order in Russia.
I would add to that is that even before the war, I said we were in what I called a crisis of late Putinism, right? When the Brezhnev metaphor was actually quite appropriate. And it's accelerated and it has kind of distorted and morphed it a bit with unpredictable results.
Well, they often ask me on the various British channels, Sky News, for example, and I always comment that even if Putin loses in a military sense, ultimately his goal is to, through this propaganda, massive wall of disinformation, to rebuild the Soviet, system. As you said, that it's a totalitarian system in the remaking. And so we can I guess, would you agree that that even if Ukraine is able to win, to achieve victory, ultimately Putin's model from 1991 onward has been, after every successive war, whether it's Chechnya, Georgia, etc. He chips away and takes more and more power. Ultimately, wars, regarding of their relative success, help him consolidate the system and gain more power. Would you agree that that's a possibility in this current war?
I think the evolution has been different. I think until very recently, Putin's clear model has been the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire. His mode of thinking, his narrative, his ideology, it's not Soviet, it's imperial. But what's happened as a result of this set of changes we now see, this process, is that almost overnight, they seem to have gone from that to a form of Stalinism. And it is interesting, there's a consistency there, because Putin reviles and abominates Lenin. You see there's all these diatribes against the Bolsheviks. But he's always venerated Stalin and the accomplishments under Stalin, hence the significance of the victory in the Patriotic War. So, this has been a recent change, but it is a change.
I would also add that if Russia is unsuccessful in Ukraine, as it increasingly looks like they will be, this is going to be a massive game changer inside of Russia. There can be no Russian empire without Ukraine. Right? This is kind of a, we say this so often, it's become kind of a truism, but it's actually accurate. Every Russian empire begins with Ukraine. None ends with Ukraine. I'll share an anecdote from my days as a reporter in Moscow in the 90s, and I was interviewing an aide to Boris Yeltsin about the decision to break up the Soviet Union in late 1991. And he said the decisive moment was Ukraine's formal declaration of independence and the referendum supporting the independence. And I said, why did that? Why wouldn't you keep the Soviet Union together without Ukraine? A younger version of myself in his 20s asked, and I got this look like, you naive little boy. And he looked at me and said, "Какой союз без Украины?" What kind of union can we have without Ukraine? So this is what is going on now is, first of all, of a whole different order of magnitude due to the emotional salience that this issue has for Putin, due to the importance of Ukraine in Russian thinking about its imperial destiny, and the scale of the defeat that they appear to be about to endure. All bets are off inside Russia.
All bets are off. It has been a premise of the entire Putin system, with good reason, that Russian civilization extends beyond the borders of the Russian Federation. This whole notion of a Russian world, which intrudes, by the way, into the Baltic states, because we have people here who the Russians call compatriots. So this has been one of the bases of legitimacy of the state. There is no Ruski Mir without Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It just collapses. So what's left? Because Russia has I think the unique thing about Russian imperialism is that it has always incorporated the histories and identities of other people into its own. And that's the way Russians think of themselves. Years ago, I was in a room with someone who regarded himself as very liberal. He was the head of one of the institutes of the Academy of Sciences in Russia. We were talking to Ukrainians, Russians, and Moldovans in Moldova on the Transnistrian border. And he thundered at this audience at one point, "Ukraine is part of my identity as a Russian." And he saw nothing exceptional about this. And I said to some of the Ukrainian youngsters, "What do you think about that?" "Oh, it's old stuff. They say this all the time." Ukrainian sons. Mark, I'm conscious of the fact that questions are building up in our chat line.
Yeah, I was noticing that myself.
Can we stop talking for a while?
Yeah.
Let the audience talk.
No, we have actually 3 or 4 really good questions from the audience, but before that, I'm going to try to weave them into my own. But you led me to an interesting. Okay, we have about 10 good minutes for questions from the audience. But let me ask you this then. Still, let's leave the elites aside, but the logic. And you mentioned that Putin is behaving. Obviously, we kind of assume that we know that he wants to rebuild a Russian empire of sorts. But the history of the Russian empires, or the Soviet Empire also, has shown us that after every unsuccessful war, I mean, be it the Russo-Japanese one, be it the first, there's such a domestic upheaval that the system strains and then collapses. So even though we may not see fissures within the elite now, imagine a situation where Ukraine reconquers its territories, kicks out the Russian army. There's tens of thousands of more coffins headed toward Russia. Do you see any repetition of any of those events from 100 or so years ago?
Well, years ago, I was saying
is it plausible to think in those dimensions?
I was saying to people half in jest years ago, who were saying, how do we get rid of Putin and his system? I said the surest way of getting rid of Putin is for him to start a war in Ukraine and lose it. It's absolutely the point you've been making. I made it myself for a number of years. Every time Russia has lost an external war, particularly one they were expected to win, there has been an internal cataclysm and a regime change of one form or another. No question.
The one exception would be the Winter War.
Because
which was followed by, obviously,
they have persuaded not only themselves, but most of the Western world that they won the Winter War. How many of us know otherwise?
Yeah. Well, they did get.
How about you, Brian? Do you think? Do you think this would a decisive Ukrainian victory would lead?
It could. I think a decisive Ukrainian victory would lead to substantial turbulence that could bring the regime down. Yes, it would either lead to maybe Russia decides to live and fight another day and back off this time and come back later, or it could lead to a collapse in the system for sure. I think we can overstate the kind of, Russian leaders, the Russian people are not kind to leaders who lose wars. But remember, the loss in the Russo-Japanese War did not cause the Romanov dynasty to collapse immediately. It took another 12 years and another war for them to fall. It did lead to the revolution of 1905, the creation of the Duma, and all of these things. But the Romanov dynasty lived another 12 years after the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. I noted the Winter War, which, they convinced everybody they won when we all know they didn't. Although they did take a chunk of Finnish territory after that war. The borders of Finland used to go right up to the outskirts of St. Petersburg. But I think we can kind of overplay this trend a bit.
I think what we're heading for, and what in part we're experiencing, is what the Russians call smutny времена, time of troubles, where there are lots of it's a near Hobbesian situation where powers are in collision, but there's no firm entity that has power. And that, I think, is where we're headed. And that can develop in all kinds of charming and less charming ways. And it could take a very long time to play itself out.
All right. Okay, well, since we're talking about Russia weakening or collapsing under some form, of at least the regime within Russia, I'm actually gonna grab one of the questions, a good one, a logical sequence to what we've been discussing on the follow-up from the Ramstein meeting and the statement by Secretary Austin that we need to weaken Russia to such an extent. Yeah. So the question there from the audience is, what more can the West do? What hasn't been done, and how do you see it from the point of view of a person familiar with the British system and then obviously U.S. system, Washington D.C. What do you think can be done or should be done to make Austin's statement actually materialize down the road?
Well, some Ukrainians have seen what I've written about this, about defining victory in 3 stages. And the first part, and absolutely indispensable, the expulsion of Russia to the territories it occupied before 24 February and not allowing any ceasefire to come into place until then. And the second, through a combination of pressures, which could take a long time, to restore Ukraine's legitimate territory to Ukraine. But what Austin has talked about, and I fully endorse it, is in the normal run of things would be very, very long term. And it requires a very firm, very clear, well worked out policy of containment on the part of the West. A policy to develop Ukraine and restore it in the way shattered advanced economies of Western Europe were restored after the Second World War. This is far from inconceivable. Whether sanctions stay or go, the amoral people who invest in places like Russia understand perfectly well that for a long time, the Russian market is just going to be toxic. They don't want to get involved in it. But Ukraine, with the right policies and government support, suddenly becomes a very attractive proposition to rebuild everything which has been destroyed. Ukraine could attract a lot of investment if it doesn't do stupid things. So there's no question that as long as the mindsets, outlooks, elites, and establishments that define Russia today are in place, Russia is going to be a threat, not just to Ukraine, but to others. And the ultimate objective, therefore, has to be to remove the threat that Russia causes. But no one can put a timeline on this. We just have to be patient. We have to preserve a favorable balance of military forces, do everything that can be feasibly done to enable Ukraine to survive and recover. And then we have to wait and be patient, because the real locus of action will be inside Russia itself. And we won't have a very limited way of means of influencing it.
So James, you're talking effectively about the new Iron Curtain that this time will go probably from Finland down to the Caucasus, more or less. That's
not necessarily an Iron Curtain. I mean, we don't want an Iron Curtain, not necessarily.
Well,
but
we don't. But
we might end up like that. What we do need is rigorous containment of Russia over a long period of time, until it changes.
In that regard, Brian, let me just throw in a nuance, and I'm going to ask you this question. This is exactly what you've been, writing and saying to our audience. Brian came up with this ingenious and very useful term, hybrid containment, several years ago, obviously. So, Brian, I mean, obviously, the idea that we need to apply pressure across all those non-military domains against Russia to actually contain. So what do you think? Has it failed in the case of Ukraine? What pressure?
Well, it wasn't in place prior to Ukraine. Back in 2020, I put all these ideas I've been having about hybrid containment into an article. The article was arguing that basically Russia's domestic political system, its kleptocratic imperial system, was incorrigibly revisionist. And as long as the system remained as such, that it was going to be an adversary. Therefore, the West had to abandon illusions of cooperation with Russia and implement a policy of containment, reminiscent of the one that we had in place from 47 to 91. I called this hybrid containment because it was going to contain both kinetic and non-kinetic elements. And at the end of the article, I laid out my policy recommendations, which at the time seemed positively insane. They were, these things were never going to happen in the eyes of many people. Guess what? They've all happened and more. I mean, I was calling for things like a SWIFT ban, banning the buying and selling of Russian sovereign debts on primary and secondary markets, export restrictions along the style of COCOM, arming the Ukrainians so they can defend themselves. I mean, every single one of these things are now Western policy. I didn't fantasize about like oil and gas bans, but those things are coming, right? So, I mean, everything I proposed as a measure to defend ourselves against Russia pre-February 24th, before the invasion of Ukraine, pre-February 24th, are now in place. And I think these things are good policy, even if there wasn't a war in Ukraine. So I think we've gone a lot farther than I ever expected us to do. There's not much more room. Europe banning Russian gas. That's about the only thing I can think of.
But just to enlarge upon that, before I arrived here, I just spent 2 hours in a webinar with officials and others, people I've known for a long time, including a number of academics. And I was astonished, but I have this kind of astonishment once a week now, that people who are committed disarmers, foes of NATO, all the rest of it. Extremely accommodationist towards Russia. They sounded, many of them, much more categorical, much tougher, much more hardline than I am today. No, but this has been, there's been a real change of...
I'm noticing the same trend in Washington.
In many, many domains. And I know that still many Ukrainians are on autopilot and they cannot mention Germany without a torrent of criticisms and abuse coming out. But who could have imagined that a social democratic chancellor would, within days of him, he himself saying these things were impermissible, doubling the defense budget, suspending Nord Stream 2, authorizing the shipment of heavy weapons deliveries to Ukraine. All of this was not only taboo, it was unimaginable just a short time ago. You know, this is, it's to be observed and admired, but the changes have been astonishing. One asks how stable they are and for how long will they endure, I don't know.
Yeah, James, thank you for mentioning Germany. Definitely a big surprise in the way they have, slowly and reluctantly, I might say, but decisively beginning to join the coalition of Western response. But let me throw the ball again at Brian for a couple of minutes before we have about 3-4 minutes. Apart from the hybrid containment, also. Brian, you came up with this idea of dismantling Putin's dark ecosystem in the West. So in line with what we've been talking about, the sanctions, how successful are we as a collective West in line with what you've been predicting or advocating for?
Yeah, the dark ecosystem was a part of the hybrid containment concept. The dark ecosystem was the thing we needed to contain. And the dark ecosystem was predicated on Russia having access to Western capital markets, Russia being able to set up shell companies to conceal beneficial ownership, to have access to our information space in a stealthy way to try to divide our societies. I mean, it remains to be seen because the sanctions are still relatively new. But again, everything I called for, we're doing and more. And I'm not sure what more we can do. What my fear is that as part of some kind of ceasefire agreement, we're going to lift sanctions, and I think that would be a grave mistake. I don't think we lift sanctions even after, even in the event of a Ukrainian victory and a Russian withdrawal. I think these sanctions are good policy to contain what I call Putin's dark ecosystem. And so I think they should remain in place. I was arguing for these measures back in 2018, 2019, 2020, before this reinvasion of Ukraine took place this year. So yeah, Russia's ability to infiltrate our financial system and our capital markets is severely hindered. Their access to Western technology, which is really, really necessary for their armaments industry, is severely hindered. So I think we've done more in 2 months than I ever imagined we would do. I couldn't be happier. And my problem now is I was turning this into a book, and now it's like all my policy recs in the book are now policies. So I have to kind of tear up the book and start all over again.
Well, that's what happens when you're a prophet. You prophesy something that's useful and successful. So you must be proud, James.
Yes, I congratulate Brian over dinner when he's next in Tallinn, but I want to answer 2 astute questions in my minute and a half remaining, put by my friend who is in the audience, Yuri Onishkiv. And he raises the question about, are we still overestimating what Russia can and is prepared to do in Ukraine? I am more concerned about another danger, that because of the fact that not only the spectacular military results north of Kiev, but the fact that Russia's major offensive in Donbass, with all the preparations they've made and with Dvornikov in charge, has evidently stalled, that we will make the mistake of underestimating Russia, and particularly underestimating the damage it can do to Ukraine. And I come back to the point I made earlier about Putin is determined either to subordinate Ukraine or wreck it. There are certain taboos we've been taking for granted now, that the historic districts of Odessa and Kiev are still standing and we're all still here. I don't want to make people more gloomy than they are. Well, Ukrainians are very realistic, because I'm sure they have thought of what I'm going to say. Don't assume that all of these sanctuaries are going to remain. This man will do anything he has the capacity to do to accomplish his aims. And the only thing that will deter him is a conviction on his part that the consequences would be far too frightening for him and for Russia to handle. And that is why tough messaging and tough deterrence by the West now is absolutely critical. It has to be made clear that if Russia uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, I don't care if it's a sub-kiloton weapon of such minute strength that it just explodes in a teacup, that all of our restraints that we have observed up to now will disappear. And I believe in those circumstances, we would be obliged, with all the risks, it will be the lesser risk at that point to intervene directly in the conflict. Obviously not with nuclear weapons. We don't need them. NATO conventional forces, US forces on their own, would turn this whole thing around in a matter of days. But it's very important, because if those restraints are not there, Putin will do I think the Russians will do anything they can.
Well, James, thank you for preempting my question. I was going to ask you, and I will ask both. I mean, Brian, what do you think of what he can use WMD, not only nuclear, but also potentially chemical weapons, say, against Azovstal? In general, how do you read the potential response of the Biden administration now that you're obviously ensconced within DC and talking to many important actors? What do you think would happen if this becomes a reality?
You mean if Russia uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine?
If Putin decides to use WMD, either chemical weapons on a massive scale or a tactical nuke to break through Ukrainian defenses, what will be the U.S.
I agree wholeheartedly.
From what you're reading in the.
Well, no, I agree with James on that. I think it will be impossible not to get involved in the conflict in a very, very direct way. And I think that message has most likely been sent to Moscow. But I also would agree with James that I do not rule out this possibility. I mean, we can't really get inside of Putin's head. It's a dark, scary place where you need a flashlight to see anything. But I mean, there is something quite off about him right now. And I don't rule anything out. So I could clearly see it going in this direction. And again, this brings us back to the question James raised in the very beginning. What is Putin going to do when he thinks he's lost? And this keeps me up at night. This definitely keeps me up at night. But yeah, I do think it's highly likely that the US would get involved directly if a nuclear weapon or WMD were used on Ukrainian territory. And I don't rule out that possibility.
And let's only hope that you're right and that our administration and NATO has used all possible channels to communicate to Putin and his regime that this will be an intolerable act, and that that will be effectively tantamount to NATO getting involved in some form or shape in the conflict. And ultimately, Ben Hodges was our first guest, and he was adamant that if this happens, the F-35s will take care of the Russian installations quite quickly. quite decisively. So let's on this more positive note. Brian, James, we're 5 minutes over time. I've used my prerogative as a moderator. Thank you for your deep insights. Always cutting edge, always innovative and interesting. You know that you have friends you have many friends within Ukraine, but now that the American University of Kiev is a reality, you're always welcome. With this, allow me to thank you on behalf of our audience, and we'll look forward to hosting you hopefully later this fall when we'll reopen our master's program. So with that, I'll make an announcement that on Thursday the 12th, we will have Ambassador Matthew Bryza talking about the importance of the Black Sea and Turkey's role in this current war. So I close this current session, and I will welcome you again in 3 days from now. Thank you, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Slava Ukraini.